Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to this Young Partners Forum event on the impact of AI on the life science industry. And we're very, very pleased to have the two panelists we have today who are really from different angles. They look at the AI from different angles, but will really, really be helpful in terms of understanding what's going on and why. Younger Partners, we're a strategy and firm and investment banking firm, started in 1996, and by a number of people who were running the same industry groups at Lehman Brothers and Morgan Stanley, et cetera. And we do have this Young Partners Forum, so once a month we'll sponsor a webcast on an issue that we think people in the industry are really either worried about or excited about because there is an opportunity. And I think today's webcast is in both categories, right? Both excited and worried about, but hopefully you'll come away with some insights that help you figure out how AI should intersect with the things that you do. Now, you saw the bios in the invitation, so I won't read them in detail, but just simply stated, Reid is a partner at Zetta Ventures, which is a firm that focuses in AI opportunities. He happens to lead their healthcare and life science effort. Interesting enough, actually, Zetta Ventures was founded 10 years ago, so they're not the latest fad venture firm. And it's been my privilege to know Dylan and also his colleagues. He's invested in a lot of different companies in this space, and I heard him speak the other day, and I think he's going to really help you understand what's going on. Eli Weinberg is a partner at Bain and Company, and in their life sciences group. I actually started out at Bain and Company when I first came out of business school, and but it was a little bit smaller, right, Eli, than it is today. But Eli is a leader in their healthcare and life sciences and private equity practices, and he is an advisor and thought partner to that group. So he does a lot of work in this area. So I have really two people, I think, who from different angles, who will really be able to shed some light on this topic. This is going to be done as a kind of a fireside chat conversation. I'm going to take the two panelists through a couple of questions, and we're going to make sure we leave some time at the end for questions for the audience. And I believe the Q&A chat function is working. If not, just raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can ask your question. So let's start out with a simple question, which is, can each of you, the panelists, really briefly explain what you do and how you ended up with a connection with AI and healthcare? So either order, so we'll do, Dylan, why don't you start, and then we'll move to Eli.
Sure. No, thank you for having me, Peter. Well, I think you did a good job of giving my background. So, Dylan, a partner at Zetta, we're an early stage fund investing in AI companies for the last 10 years. And so, connection to AI is deep. I have a background in computer science and built some very early machine learning research around computer vision and started an early company in the space. So, I've gotten to see it evolve over the last 10 years or so. We invest broadly across categories, but as Peter said, do mostly healthcare and life sciences. And that is somewhat new for us. I think we're always looking for the areas that AI can have the most impact. And I think for the last couple of years, at least for me, it's definitely been in the life sciences and to a lesser extent in healthcare. Some really exciting, really impactful things going on there.
Eli?
Great. Yeah, I'll go. I've been working with big life science companies for probably the past decade on whatever the enterprise priorities are. And over the past few years, up until maybe a year ago, machine learning and AI was fifth or sixth on most companies' agenda. And in the past year, it's become one or two for everyone. And I think some of the things we'll talk about some of the use cases now and some of the early demonstrations that we're doing really make us think that AI's crossed a substantial bridge to being useful and being useful in a lot of different ways. And so we're working on how is that changing the way that people work and how companies should think about a lot broader questions than I think previous technologies, which were much more about one use case or another. In the past year, we've really seen AI get to a point that it's fundamentally changing a bunch of different things that companies do. So happy to talk about it.
Right. Let's start out with a big picture, though. I tell you, if I had $1 for every definition of AI, I wouldn't be talking to the two of you. I'd have my own island with my own super yacht somewhere down in the Caribbean. So let's start out, because I think it's very important to make sure we understand what do we mean by what do you think we mean by AI and what the boundaries are. And so if you could perhaps each of you define AI, what you see as a definition, but also what are the major areas of healthcare where AI can apply? Because AI doesn't apply to everything in healthcare, right? So for example, Eli, you want to start?
Sure, I will go ahead. Look, to me, AI is the ability of a machine to mimic and go beyond human cognitive skills. It could be visual perception, it could be pattern recognition, it could be weighing pros and cons and making a decision. It certainly could be about communication. And I think in healthcare, the things that are most relevant recently are the systems have just gotten really good at processing unstructured data and drawing insights from them. And there's a lot of unstructured data in that flowing around the healthcare system. And then the other one is that artificial intelligence has gotten a lot better at generating content in the past couple of months. And so there is a lot of paperwork being pushed around in healthcare, and there's a lot of personalization of content that's needed. So I would think of those two, the use of unstructured data and the content generation, where we're seeing the biggest strides right now.
Yeah. Dylan?
Yeah, totally agree with all that. Maybe starting with the definition. So maybe building on what Eli said, starting with the definition. They used to say AI is whatever computers can't do yet. But I think over the last couple of years, we have really crossed this chasm. And so I think about today's sort of state-of-the-art systems, importantly, is those that can learn directly from data without explicit instruction and can solve a range of tasks that they weren't explicitly trained on. Call that transfer learning, or what a lot of people call generalization. So I think that's the state that we're at today. Having been investing in AI for the last 10 years, I think a real pattern that we've seen in deployment is that the first impact with things that it's AI, a new AI technology, is most useful for are those that are like pretty low risk and I would say support existing workflows and players. And so I think Eli's exactly right. That's in areas like content generation, areas like analysis. The biggest impact, we believe, and have started to see in other sectors, is always in areas that are more mission critical and that create new workflows and support new companies, what we call sort of AI native. And so, in healthcare, I think we're seeing a lot of success in back office automation. So things like clinical documentation, medical coding, prior authorization, sort of moving around to papers. I think we're starting to see things that are clinical adjacent, so things like clinical decision support, tools for physicians, sort of second opinion type diagnostics. Long term, the opportunities that we're really excited about are, how does AI change the delivery and course of care? How do you build new kinds of provider organizations around some of these conversational and analytical capabilities? And so, for instance, we're early investors in a vertically integrated mental health clinic that combines clinicians with these large language models for continuous care. Very early and nascent, but these pieces coming together in something that's a lot more core to what touches patients. In life sciences, same, I would say, trajectory. We're seeing a lot of early success in improving the design of drugs, especially in biologics.
Yeah.
So, known targets, known molecules, can we make them better? Can we optimize the sequences so that they're more expressive, so that they're more manufacturable? I think the long-term potential in bio, and where a lot of these companies are going towards, or can you start to improve drugging or targeting of previously untargetable or undruggable targets, creating new medicines versus optimizing the ones that we already have. Long term, I think there's a really exciting potential for new target discovery, new definitions and understanding of disease subtypes, and the bucket that people have been calling precision medicine for a while, but I think is mostly underwhelmed. I think that's really exciting opportunities on the horizon. So I think I think both of our jobs, all of our jobs to some extent, are trying to understand market timing, and we're in the early days and we're seeing some early success in these like first and second stages, but I think the long-term potential of this is going to take a while to work out and look very weird and different from the way that things look now.
Yeah, there's so many areas that where you can apply AI in healthcare. I mean, Dylan, I'm glad you mentioned drug discovery. I mean, there have been a couple of fairly well-publicized situations where companies have been able to take thousands of candidates, get down to a smaller number to really focus on, and then show that it's really effective. But also, it's also in, you talked about, patient care and hospital management and so forth, but also diagnostics. I mean, I guess now AI can take an X-ray or an MRI and do a pretty decent job of determining whether there's cancer or so forth, so on, which is, of course, freaking out a lot of radiologists. But, but that's a good application, right, of AI because of the nature of how AI works. So it's very, very interesting. But, it's like that scene from Indiana Jones, when he in the Holy Grail, it's like, you got to choose wisely. And it's not always the shiniest chalice, right? And out of all those chalices that Indiana Jones saw, there won't be just one, but it's not going to be all of them, right? When it comes down to which ones really are effective and are safe, right? So, if you, on that note, it comes out of the question of where is AI going to be most successful in healthcare, right? Because it can apply to a lot of different areas here, but the nature of AI and where it is won't have the same degree of success as you go from one category to another. Do you have any thoughts about where are the areas in healthcare, whether it's patient management or drug discovery or diagnostic, where are the areas that you think inherently AI will be the most successful? Eli, any comments?
I think
I'm randomly choosing you guys.
I think a couple areas where it is already successful. We see companies already putting things into development, and these are, I think, building on some things that Dylan said. For sure, a lot of that manual documentation that goes into a regulatory submission, a clinical trial, maintenance of those licenses. So that is a really obvious and good use case that companies are putting into, or a class of use cases that companies are putting into production now and will continue to get value from. You talked about the drug discovery and getting insights from the molecular data. I would add to that getting insights from patient level data. We can knit together a lot of unstructured data better than we could previously. And the other area that we are seeing a lot of companies experiment, but the experiments look very good, is in personalization of customer-facing content. So, if you're rather than sort of having 3 or 4 segments of physicians that you want to communicate to, having personalized content for each physician about how their practice looks relative to others, what's the information that's relevant to them, what kind of messages resonate. I would highlight that as the other one that, again, we're seeing early success, and it's just about rolling it out across a broader set of activities and therapeutics.
Yeah. Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, I second that. I think, long term, the most interesting area, and I think the area where AI will have the biggest impact, is in improving our understanding of biology. So not automating what people can do today, but really trying to probe the areas that we don't understand, the gap between what we know and what affects patients. And so, looking at drug discovery probably is the area that's most well aligned with that capability. Is an area that's really exciting.
Yeah. You've invested a lot of companies, but also you look at a lot of areas, Dylan. can you share maybe a few case studies of where AI is really getting traction and really is, you may or may not have to mention the company, but the company or areas where AI has really been a success story.
Yeah, I can give two examples that I think illustrate very different points. And so the first on the healthcare side, we've got a company that does, AI uses computer vision basically for reading dental X-rays. And so dentists use them to look at X-rays to both identify, cavities, caries, potential root canals, and predict which are going to get significantly worse. And dentistry is, would say, like medical adjacent in the sense that you're dealing with a lot of the same data, but it's in a very different commercial regime. And maybe most importantly, a major problem in dentistry is what's called the case acceptance rate. And so, if your oncologist recommends that you have a treatment or a diagnostic done, you're very, very close to 100% chance going to take their advice. With dentists, it's in the low double digits. It's somewhere between 10 and 20%. And so a really major problem in dentistry is diagnostic accuracy, but really getting patients to accept, believe, to have a conversation with patients around the work that really needs to get done. And so our company has built like a really, really robust diagnostic tool. It's significantly more accurate than dentists, and they have really incredible benchmark data. They've looked at about 3 million dental records paired with the diagnostic, and they're now deployed in a couple hundred dental offices en route to actually might be a couple thousand now. Because of these large DSOs, and the real value that the tool solves, despite being a really cutting edge AI tool, is really around patient communication. And so there's a lot of now data that this company has been able to show that just having the second opinion, having the AI that can both show you in a non-biased or differently biased way where there are procedures that need to get done, along with some insight or analysis on what might happen if they're untreated, has been really commercially valuable for dentists, hopefully valuable to patients as well. But that's been a really strong ROI case, again, around improving case acceptance. We have another company on the drug discovery side that does antibody design. And so they work with drug companies basically to improve, or in a lot of cases, design brand new antibodies that can be used as drugs. A lot of the top drugs now are monoclonal antibodies. And a major problem for antibodies, biologics, they're expensive. They need to be stored at really cold temperatures. And most or a lot of antibodies are need to be administered through injection, through infusion. And so basically having an IV bag, which requires you to be at a center, which is expensive and burdensome, and it's one of the main reasons actually that these drugs are expensive and people do not adhere to them as well as they should, despite being life-saving. And so this company, using AI in combination with a lot of interesting kind of protein engineering innovation, so wet lab and dry lab stuff together, was basically able to re-engineer an existing antibody for a large pharmaceutical company to be on the order of about 25 times more expressive, which basically is across a threshold that allows them to take a drug that they have now, which is administered through infusion, to something that can be subcutaneously administered, so administered by injection by the patient, which from a cost and adherence standpoint is huge. And that's totally on the back of AI. So both sort of in front of the scenes, behind the scenes, across sort of care and life science. But in each of these cases, the ROI was very different. In some cases it's really human and perception, and in some cases it's pure sort of science. And we see that sort of across the board, across applications.
Yeah, Eli, any case studies, examples of where clients of yours have been able to use AI successfully?
Yeah, I think most of my clients are focused on the near-term ones. So they're really looking hard at all of that internal body of work. I mentioned the compilation of a regulatory dossier, which is like a 30 gigabyte document typically, and so you can only imagine the amount of manual effort that goes in there. So there's probably 30 or 40 different use cases just within that one. There are other areas that involve manual work. It's like reading an adverse event report that somebody has sent in and classifying it and doing it in a way that you're comfortable. I see a question in the chat about the regulators doing it in a way that you're comfortable sending along to a regulator. So that's the most near term is the, and Dylan talked about existing workflows. So the kind of automation and improved intelligence in the existing workflows. And then beyond that, it's just a lot of experimentation. I think the guiding principle is every company is looking at it pretty heavily, and it just matters what the enterprise's objectives are. So a company that is launching a bunch of new therapeutics is looking at applications and content generation. A company that has a bunch of regulatory filings is looking at regulatory filings. A company that's doing a lot of complex manufacturing is looking at manufacturing. So it's hard to say what the focus is. It's about everywhere at this point. It depends on what the individual companies are trying to achieve.
There's a lot of adverse publicity about AI that's been running around, such as AI makes things up or AI hallucinates, right? For example, and not only makes things up, but in detail, like put footnotes for academic research where the research doesn't exist. So there's a lot of controversy about what explains this. What explains this hallucination and whatever, and is there any way to prevent it? Certainly, one of the comments is a lot of it depends upon the database it's working off of, right? And the more defined the database and the more scrubbed the database, AI is less likely to make mistakes. So, the question then is, of the things that seem to be the Achilles heels or, the failings of AI, what do you see those are, and what do you think is going to happen there? Are they going to get solved? Is it because it's applied to the wrong place, wrong application, or is it because the technology needs to be advanced or modified? And what's your feeling?
That's for me. A lot of the technical failings we're seeing, or supposed technical failings we're seeing, can be pretty well controlled. So if you are having Gen AI work on a company data set and summarize that, it's very hard to get it to hallucinate if you're telling it to reference an existing set of known data. So for all of the risks that exist, we've seen some pretty successful mitigation, whether it's writing the prompt correctly, so you're prompting it to actually explain and correctly reference, or using an embedded data set and having it limit its response to what it sees in the data set. So a lot of the technical risks, I think we're seeing as manageable. A lot of the risks towards capturing the value, I think, come for outside of the technology. So, we talked a little bit about clinical decision support tools. And I think that's one where I totally believe that the technology is there, and we've seen head-to-head with human that the systems at least are more reliable, if not making earlier and better identification of disease and early diagnosis. But there's been pushback from the people who do the work. So physicians, there was a paper a while ago, Epic released a sepsis tool. The main pushback was from physicians that it would be supplementing or replacing. And there's just a lot, especially in the US, around litigation and patient. So if you're treating a patient based on a tool and the patient is harmed, tracing that back to a human versus the tool is really complex. So there's a lot of the layers around how we implement those things in a way that don't bring on risk. And if we do bring on risk, how do we deal with it? To me, in the work that we've been doing, it's much less around the pure technical limitations and more around the implementation and the human side that carry that forward to the end customer, the end consumer, who's typically a patient in the situation.
Yeah, Dylan.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in most cases, applied AI is a trust and safety problem. It's not a technical problem. I would say heavy emphasis on the trust, which is, even if something is robust and reliable, do people trust it? Do we understand the ways in which they fail, knowing that that's a bit of a moving target? And so I think the real challenge for anybody building an AI right now is how do you build in the trust and the safety? How do you build in the good evaluations, so people are really understanding what these systems are doing? How do you build in the right guardrails? How do you build in the right escalation paths? I mean, there are things that, are going to be difficult for AI to do. I think in most cases, it really is about, how do you intersperse AI with humans sort of in the loop? And I think that'll be true for a really long time, but figuring that out both organizationally, practically, and also there are a bunch of sort of unknown legal problems around here. The last several hundred years of industrial development have been built on human cognition. Now we're throwing something new into the mix, and figuring out, how to adapt all our systems to that is a big challenge. But I will say, I think it's highly application domain problem specific. You can talk about these broad general terms like guardrails, which I just did, but when you get into these applications, it's all about understanding the stakeholders, understanding the stakes, understanding the context, and working it out in that case.
By the way, you guys,
big rewards for those that do.
You guys are very fortunate. I had a webcast on careers. I've been involved with a series that's gone on for 12 years about different careers on February 1 on AI. And the two panelists who were, well-known people in AI, it was focused on what are the careers, what do you need to do to have a career. But I surprised them because I made ChatGPT the third panelist and told them just before the broadcast. And I asked ChatGPT the same questions, what are the myths of the profession? Where are the opportunities? What kind of person? And I got all these answers, right? And so I read them, and it was hilarious, But I decided not to torture the two of you and do the same thing here.
Appreciate that.
Although the two panelists for that, at the end, I asked them, "What did you think of ChatGPT's answers?" And they said a little bit wordy, but actually not bad, right? So, but those of us who used to read science fiction, so forth, or watch movies, whether it was iRobot, which is the famous classic science fiction thing where there were the three rules, and the last one for the robot was do no harm to a human being, and then there was a clash between rule 1 and rule 3, and how that Space Odyssey 2001, and so forth. Or what was it? War Games. Remember the with Matt?
Yep.
What's his name? And where at the end, the only way they stopped the computer from launching missiles was to tell him, try to figure out a winning scenario. And he runs through all of the scenarios. He says, there's no winning scenario, so I'm not going to send off the missile. So if this whole issue about AI and computers has been around for a long, long time, it's gotten a lot more publicity, recently. But do you have any general rules to say where you think AI in healthcare should really not be pursued, right? Because it's just a mismatch, either because it won't produce the right result or it might be harmful. Any areas that you would just say, stay away, right? I certainly in terms of warfare would really be a lot happier if AI did not control nuclear missiles. They would make me a lot more comfortable. But anything in healthcare where you say investors and companies should stay away?
Nothing, I think, inherently that we should stay away from. I think the goal of healthcare companies is almost always to improve the lives of patients, and we should do everything we can to do that. I think finding the right approach, right? I think there's a lot of areas where I would not want AI-driven autonomy, but I think that's a very different question. And so I think, anything that touches patients for the foreseeable future, I think it's really important to have a clinician in the loop. Also just a good strategy for getting AI systems to work well. And I think a lot of these sensitive areas, having them in the right context is really important. So if it's patient facing, having a clinician in the loop, if it's diagnostic, having it as a support tool versus the final diagnostic, I think human decision making, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be really important, both for getting these products to work well and more importantly, building the sort of trust and safety layer that I think we need. But nothing I think out of pocket is not worth pursuing, or at least exploring.
Eli?
Yeah, I think it's more, there's not particular areas, but it's more about what limits there are in place. So I for sure think it's fine to use AI generated content in marketing. But just because you can create an infinite amount of content doesn't mean your customers want to receive an infinite amount of content. And there are a lot of people out there who don't want to talk to a robot. Most of us, when we call a call center and we realize it's it's an automated system, we try to press whatever button gets us to a human. So I think having awareness across the use cases in how will this actually come across to the end user and the customer is important. And then the other one I would add on is I do see people talking about the reduced need for clinical trials. And I think probably the last thing we would want to do in the industry is not be sure that our drugs work in humans, and really validate that with rigorous experimentation before we market them. But I also haven't heard a lot of people with clear ideas on how it would work. So that's the only one I think. There are higher and lower risk ones, but in terms of the particular industry that we're in, which is changing the biology of people, is where we want to be most careful.
Yeah, but you do have a good point about the interface with patients and customers, very, very important. And a classic problem of technology people is they don't use they don't try their own product to see what it feels like to be on the other side. I think someone once defined patients as someone who could call Verizon customer service and actually get all the way through to have their problem solved. That they said that's a definition of true patience, right? Yeah. By the way, I read a really good article in the Financial Times where they interviewed the heads of technology or the relevant area at three major firms. And it was a very interesting quote from the guy at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. And he said, we have three rules. One is, in the current stage of where AI is, and he said, this could change a year from now, 6 months from now. But based on what AI can do, we have three rules. Number one, primarily use it for first drafts. That's the first thing. Second, fact check the whole thing like hell, because there's a significant probability something in it is not factually correct. And three, don't use it where the consequences of failure are really bad, right? And he said, but that's a rule today. And he said, maybe 6 months or a year from now, the rule will be different. But that's how we've approached it, in all the areas that we're thinking about AI. Now I'm going to flip to a less easy, not that the previous questions were easy, but a less easy one, which is, one of the big issues is the need to put in the right guardrails with regard to the use of AI. And what do you think the practices and self-regulation, regulatory measures that you think should be put into place in order to prevent a number of potential downsides from the use of AI in life sciences and healthcare?
I think I went first. Yeah, I kind of pointed at this before, but I do think these things are super application specific. So what makes sense in one space might not make sense in another. But I think as a general principle, there are a number of places that you can put guardrails into effect from sort of a technical standpoint, from an organizational standpoint. And so, making sure before your model is released that it's robust, that there are clear evaluations is sort of an initial step. Thinking about guardrails that live on top of the model. Nobody is ever experiencing a direct relationship with AI. There are a lot of layers in between those, and so that's another opportunity to constrain the output of what people see. For instance, in a clinical setting, rather than seeing the actual output of the model, that model maps to known clinical terminology or known phrases. That might make sense. And then, beyond that, like I said, having the right sort of human guardrails or humans in the loop, either in real time, so actually like looking at each interaction, or in retrospect. So either seeing, doing quality control, monitoring things, and having real escalation paths, the same way that we're used to on customer calls and customer service calls right now. At one point, humans taking over for a small subset, and so I think there's multiple points of intervention depending on the application and the space that you need, the level of risk that you're, willing to or need to take. Depends on what those are, but having multiple sets of guardrails at the different points, I think, is really important, regardless of what you're building.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the issues is, guardrails depend. The concept of guardrail is that you have to know where the edge of the road is, right? And one of the real problems here is figuring out where the hell the edge of the road is. And I think social media is a great example where now for years there's been, how do you put in guardrails to defend there's not abuse and disinformation, or whatever. And I'm not totally, but I'm partially sympathetic to the folks at, Facebook, et cetera, because when you think about where things, social media gets screwed up, it is actually very hard to figure out where the edge of the road is, right? I mean, do you agree with that, Dylan and Eli?
Yeah, it's always a really hard problem. It's always subjective. I think one of the things that makes me really hopeful about AI, compared to social media, which is an analogy a lot of people are drawing right now, is that we're talking about the risks before they're a problem. I think the negative effects of social media caught most people, including a lot of the people that work there, some of my partners who are very senior at Facebook included, just by surprise. It came out of the gate as something that felt unequivocally good. And I think we now know or are taking seriously the fact that every technology is a tool that has, positive and negative use cases, these dual use problems and unintended consequences. And so, for all the risk that AI proposes, there's a lot of people thinking really hard and talking very loudly about what the risks might be, about where the edges of the road could be, and how we should operate in this space where we have a certain amount of uncertainty.
Well, certainly one group whose life has become miserable is, I wouldn't want to be a college professor or a high school or a university. I mean, trying to figure out what is an essay written by ChatGPT is really very, very hard, right? Although I'll tell a story that, when I was doing this career panel and I asked ChatGPT the answer to these 6 questions, afterwards I said, hey, what the hell? Let me have it write a poem to my wife. So I typed in, I said, I would like to write a poem to my wife. I gave it a couple of parameters. It produced a poem in about 30 seconds. And I sent it to my wife, who, by the way, is been a professor at Columbia University and a dean for like 27 years. 30 seconds later, an email comes back from her. HMMMM period, Chat GPT, right? So, I finally learned, well, Chat GPT might be able to fool some, but not my wife, So Eli, answer the same question about, what do you think the practices should be in terms of self-regulation, regulatory measuring for guardrails?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is it's moving so fast. Every company has 100 experiments running. So I don't think, even if you wanted to, it would be possible to put the genie back in the bottle. What I do think is, I agree totally with Dylan. Every project needs to have the review of what are the types of risks that you're worried about and how are you managing them. And so I do like it when companies are saying, if you're doing an AI project, just tell us about the ethical risks, the computational bias, the data privacy. There's 7 or 8 categories. And so for any work that's going on at the level of an individual use case, work through those and have an honest conversation about whether you're comfortable with the risks you're taking forward. Like I said, I don't think that it does much to create a bunch of enterprise architecture. I would like to see, because we're all learning so fast, a higher degree of company to company sharing of knowledge as we go. And where have we hit a risk that really got us concerned and we backed away from? Did we learn an interesting way to control hallucinations in a particular application, those kind of things? And I think that's happening through some of the industry groups, but I would like to see that continue. And the thing that makes me hopeful is that our industry has been able to handle a bunch of tricky ethical issues over the times. We every company knows how to do compassionate use in clinical trials now, and wasn't necessarily always. Every company has figured out how to run pediatric patients in trials. There's a lot of programs to benefit patients who wouldn't otherwise have access to the medication. So I think actually, we're in a higher risk industry, but because of that, we have a lot of the skills within most companies to handle these things in an appropriate way, and that makes me optimistic.
Yeah. Now, on the same note, I'm going to shift the question a little bit, because I started asking you what's going on today in terms of regulation and guardrails and so forth. But thinking ahead, what are the self-regulatory, regulatory, and management practice heading? In what direction are they heading? In other words, what do you see happening over the next couple of years? Dylan?
Well, this is really a question Eli would have a lot more visibility to than I do. I have no idea. It seems like it's all over the map. There's a lot of interest and attention on this space, but historically that has not led to a lot of regulation. So I do think, at least for a while, we're going to have to rely on self-regulation. Again, I think that's going to be very specific to the areas. I've been really impressed and encouraged by how seriously people in healthcare and life sciences are taking these problems, I would say, relative to some other industries. So I think there's a real sense of responsibility to get this right, not just like within the bounds of what's legal, but actually what's going to be best for patients, what's going to be best for the industry. So I'm not too worried about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eli, same question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm better qualified, but I'll try also.
But you're second, but you're second in the pecking order. So
and you don't know that I wasn't looking at ChatGPT in the meantime. So a lot of companies are doing what I would call good self-regulatory activities now. So not standing in the way of folks who want to try ChatGPT in the workflow, but providing a secure enterprise environment. So if you're going to do this, at least do it in a way that you're not leaking patient data or something like that. I think that the regulators themselves are coming along really quickly too. I've spoken with FDA and EMA, and if anybody in the world is impacted by the load of regulatory work that happens, it's the regulators themselves. So I sort of anticipate that a lot of the lower risk use cases that we talked about of content generation, drug discovery, safety reporting, things like that, the regulators are actually going to be very supportive. And the regulations probably don't even have to change all that much. It might be a little bit about like most of these processes already have human oversight. So it might be a bit of what percentage has that oversight shifted. I think that there will be all sorts of regulation, litigation around things that are around patient treatment. I don't think we've quite hit the tip of the iceberg on that one yet.
Yeah. Of course, the solution on the litigation side, you just say, sue Hal, right? By the way, we have our 19th annual Pharmaceutical Executive Conference covering biotech and pharma in early November. And our keynote speaker is Peter Stein, who oversees all drug approval, whatever. And I certainly, we'll have fireside chat. I certainly plan to ask him that same question, which is, how is the FDA going to deal with AI in terms of its own processes, but also the processes that companies are using, when they're developing, drugs, et cetera. So it's going to be interesting. By the way, one of the things I love to study is new technologies and the speed with which they get they actually penetrate the market. And if you look at most things, whether it's the internet or light bulbs, right? When Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, or nanomaterials, or DNA sequencing, so forth, you'll notice one thing, which is most of the things take a long time to finally get out into the market, and usually it takes longer than the stock market thinks, right? So nanomaterials, for example, came out, everyone got excited, everyone named their company Nano something, but it took a long time because there was issues about manufacturability, and then they were trying to replace certain products. So there was a long period of trying to show that it was equivalent, et cetera, et cetera. The interesting thing about AI and things like the internet and so forth is they don't have those barriers. In other words, they don't have manufacturability. It's so forth. So it gets implemented much faster. That's good news, but it's bad news on this side, which is sometimes a little bit slower is better because you figure out where the problems are, right? And so I'm both excited about AI in healthcare because the barriers are relatively low for adoption, but also it may move faster than common sense and regulation can really figure out how to get a handle around it. And I hope we end up on the right side of that, of that equation. I mean, do you share that point of view, either one of you?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, around the pace of acceleration, AI and ML have been hot topics for a long time in healthcare, but it was restricted by, you needed to know how to code Python and maybe visualize stuff in Tableau and, generally be able to handle a set of tools and have statistical training. And one of the big differences with generative AI is ChatGPT is literally the fastest growing web offering in history. I think they added 100 million people, 100 million users in 2 months. So we're really at a time where it's pretty incredible how quick things are catching on. But I agree with you. This isn't an industry where the regulations and the broader landscape have moved all that quickly. So there's a mismatch.
Dylan, any comments?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. I mean, the one thing I would say though is like, I without making pulling us into AI regulation, I do think the right place to look at, AI is at the deployment side versus the development side. And so, what's happening within the offices of OpenAI is really far from, where these things are going to be applied. If you're writing poetry for your wife, I'm glad there's no regulation around that. Maybe it's just self-regulation. Whereas when you talk about some of these critical downstream application areas, and it's going to be specific to the domain and the problem, but I think in a lot of cases, the things that people are most worried about, the use cases that most people are worried about, are actually pretty well protected by existing laws. And so you can say some of our existing regulation is going to come under a lot more threat, pressure. We'll have to adapt in certain places, but I think unlike some other technologies, maybe even unlike the internet, we have a bunch of laws and frameworks in place that I think will are at least a good starting point for a lot of the applications of AI that we're most worried about.
Yeah. Before we turn to questions, we have at least one question, and I'm going to open up the questions. The one thing we haven't talked about, which I think is the only thing that might slow down AI, is the fact that it takes a lot of computer processing power. And right now, what's going on, like initially you could use ChatGPT, didn't cost you anything, but gradually, it requires a lot of processing power, right? And that's helped certain chip manufacturers and so forth. Might even crowd out some of these cryptocurrency, miners, competing for computing power. But that's one of the things which is people haven't talked about, which is it's very costly to run these systems and models. And one of the questions will be, will there be a shakeout as the cost, right? As people start to recover costs and feel, okay, I've got to cover my costs or make a profit, it might actually start to weed out applications where the value added doesn't match where the cost is going. I mean, do you feel that way?
So I actually think this is a bit of a misnomer. Well, first off, so there's two big costs associated with AI. The first is in training these models. That's a very big one-time computational cost, so to speak. So, these large or scale models could be anywhere from, we don't know the numbers, but, tens to hundreds to potentially billions of dollars in compute costs, but that gets amortized through each one. And then the second is the cost of actually running the models, what's called inference. And so that's variable every time you run it. I think those are both coming down very fast and very dramatically, and don't get talked about a lot. But I think, we've seen probably 1,000-fold decrease in the cost of inference, which is, I think, the cost to pay the most attention to, because that's the one that gets larger at scale. And I think in training, we're seeing, well, the biggest, fanciest sort of number one models are actually getting more expensive to train. The ability to train pretty good models, and we're seeing this now with Facebook's Llama 2, which is an open source model, so we have a lot of data on it, is, orders of magnitude, somewhere between 3 and 4. So, 1,000 to 10,000 times cheaper to train. So I actually think this debate is going to be a lot less relevant in the future, and it's happening really quickly.
So the message is, Dylan, is those of you who are cryptocurrency miners, you can relax. You're not going to be crowded out. Eli, any comment that, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience?
Yeah, the other thing I'd add on that is if you asked me a year ago, I probably would have said, well, I think for a lot of these medical applications, we'll need to wait for GPT-5 or a medical specific model, or you're going to see big pharma companies creating and tuning their own models. In 100% of the use cases we've done, GPT-3.5 is fine. And you have to add in some tuning and some guardrails and some prompt engineering, but I don't think that we're anywhere near where people thought we'd be, which is like, we need a $20 billion model to get useful results. We're fine. We've got plenty to do with the models that we have on hand.
Okay, great. So the first question was typed into the Q&A chat box. And the question from Mr. Anonymous Attendee is, how do you foresee regulators like the FDA restrict or regulate the use of AI tools or AI-generated data in drug/diagnostic approval?
I think I alluded to that one before. So specifically in the approvals, and regulators are going to they are still going to need the same things that they always had, which is any individual data point on whether the drug or the diagnostic or the device worked in a human, that has to be 100% traceable into the final package. I think that when they see what these tools are able to do, and that a lot of the tools that we're working on with clients are a combination of the Gen AI and pure kind of Python coding or other programming languages, and it actually does make things trainable and explainable. I don't think they have a good reason to push back on using these tools to sort of compile the data. I think they will have questions on, much bigger questions on, like, if the diagnostic itself is, a pathology tool or some kind of vocal biomarker that is, more of a black box in how it's getting to its diagnoses, then they'll have bigger questions. But in the actual taking the data and submitting it to a regulator, I think regulators are, if anything, pretty excited about the degree of standardization that this offers.
Yeah. Dylan, any comment?
Yeah, I've been really surprised at how forward-thinking the FDA has been, both on the medical device side, so software as a medical device. There's been, I think, pretty clear pathways to approval, and I have yet to see the FDA be the bottleneck for a new medical device or a new digital diagnostic getting approved. Usually the payers, in terms of why these things don't work. And on the clinical trial side, same thing. I mean, we're seeing some real movement. I think two areas that the FDA has been out in front of, which is great. The first is in, animal testing for early stage development. So changing the guidelines so you no longer need to go through, animal testing, especially for things like cosmetics that don't have the same sort of issues. And the second is in synthetic trial arms. And so this is not replacing humans in synthetic in clinical trials, but getting more signal from real world evidence, being able to run smaller control arms to look at more things. And so, both places I would have expected to be real challenges to get past the FDA, and been really pleasantly surprised that they've been ahead of it. Now, maybe that'll change. That's something we're definitely watching out for.
And the only other caveat is, for some of these things, you have to meet the most stringent regulator in the world. So if a small company somewhere just mandates, we're not going to take these reports unless it's 100% manual, you'll still have to do it 100% manually or walk away from that region, which is unlikely.
Okay. So here's a second question from Glenn Ottinger. he said, can you please talk more about individualizing content for different practitioners? He says, Eli mentioned using AI to help determine what messages resonate with end users.
Yeah, I can talk about it. There are still, in pharma, there are some sales forces that are going and talking to 10,000 physicians. And so being able to send one physician a note that says, it recognizes that in their zip code, they're the least, the least likely to use the right diagnostic. And then in another one, it might be, you're using all the right diagnostics, you're prescribing the right things, but for some reason you have the highest rejection rate of reimbursement. So those are the kinds of things that you can, if you had an infinite amount of time, you'd want to tailor all, but you were doing it manually, you'd be manually writing different emails and letters and bringing up different topics with those physicians. So I think we believe it's really useful. The trick is it also depends on having insight into what messages will resonate with those physicians, what formats they want to see. So it has to rest on a lot of, analytics and existing insight. And of course, it has to be aligned with whatever the broader kind of brand and enterprise objectives are too. So it's not simple. I haven't seen any companies put it into production yet, but certainly companies that are well into development.
Mm-hmm. Dylan, any comments from you, or you're allowed to pass? You're allowed to pass.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great answer, and this is not a space I know much about.
So we've reached the 1 hour mark, and first of all, I really want to thank the two panelists. I think we went through a lot of questions and a lot of material, and some tough questions, particularly as it relates to guardrails and things. And certainly, I think you shed some light on a lot of the issues and applications that are not necessarily known to the general public or people in healthcare. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank the audience for attending and a couple good questions that were posted. And again, we're very, very pleased to have two, very good panelists today. And they're very grateful that I didn't unleash ChatGPT on them. I would have loved to do that, and do, text to speech and, have this, the Microsoft Word, voice, coming across the internet, but decided not to do that. So thank you very much. Again, we've recorded this, so those of you who want to watch it again, and those people registered but couldn't attend, we'll make it available to you on the Young Partners website. So thank you very much, and again, thank you, Dylan and Eli, for doing a terrific job as panelists.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.